So it turns out a number of squads are struggling to stay under the $140 million budget cap limit set for this year, despite a dramatic rise in inflation and a cost of living crisis. Some teams, such as Ferrari and McLaren, have already admitted publicly that they're on track to breach the cap this season due to cost increases and are in desperate need of a compromise deal to help ease their situation. While F1 executives and the FIA are working to find a solution, not all teams are in favour of a change, particularly smaller teams that lack the financial resources to approach the spending limit. So this has pushed things to the brink, forcing some teams to postpone upgrades for fear of committing to spending now that will put them in violation of the rules later in the year. Meanwhile, Red Bull team principal Christian Horner is particularly agitated about the situation, fearing that if no agreement is reached to alleviate the budget cap issues, teams will be forced to sack employees or force pay cuts on them in order to stay within the rules. We've had to rein everything back. I think the problem with uncertainty with a cap and with the rate of inflation that we're seeing is there's only parts and people that are really the biggest cost drivers. It would be, I think, a catastrophe for the formula that people would have to take a hit for something that is beyond their control. I think there's a moral issue that needs to be dealt with as well there. I know the FIA are looking at it, together with the Liberty guys, because nobody could have expected this kind of inflation. Horner believes that the current budget cap crisis is more than just a problem for the top teams, and the fact that squads lower down the order are suffering demonstrates how serious the problem is. Perhaps I'm the one that's talked the most about it, but our problems are not the biggest in this area. I think Mercedes, they employ more people and they have higher salaries within their group than ourselves. Ferrari is again another very big team with high costs. When you hear of teams in the mid-grid that are also going to be in breach of the cap, that were pushing for the cap to be lower originally, I think it shows. And it's not about development. It's not about development being the biggest contributor to these costs. It's just the fixed costs of going racing with freight, with energy, with utilities, and with the supply of components. It's just gone stratospheric. Now, Horner is not the only one raising the issue. In fact, the situation could be so dire that it may decide the championship if teams exceed the cost cap limit, as many expect. However, because there is no precedent, no one knows which penalties from a list of possible sanctions outlined in the rules are likely to be applied. Those rules contain a long list of violations, most of which are related to teams failing to report their spending accurately or on time, or attempting to deceive the cost cap administration, the body in charge of monitoring adherence to them. In Azerbaijan, we learned of the first such offence, albeit a minor one, when Williams was fined $25,000 for failing to file its 2021 paperwork by the deadline of March 31st. The most important sections of the financial regulations, however, deal with simple cases of exceeding the spending limit. Such violations will be referred to the Cost Cap Adjudication Panel, a panel of 6 to 12 judges proposed by the FIA and the teams. Any decision they make can later be challenged in the International Court of Appeal by the team in question or by other parties. Overspending, whether voluntarily declared by a team or discovered later through an investigation, falls into two categories. There's a simple cutoff at 5% of the cap. Anything below that is considered a minor overspend, while anything above that is considered a material overspend. The latter case is much more serious. That 5% figure is not insignificant, however. Teams are currently aiming for $140 million plus $1.2 million for the 22nd race, for a total of $141.2 million in 2022. Thus, a 5% breach represents an extra $7 million in spending, which equates to a massive amount of R&D, potentially enough to make the difference between winning and losing the title. The rules state that if the overspend is less than 5%, the CCAP may impose a financial penalty and/or any minor sporting penalties. The financial penalty is simply defined as a fine to be determined on a case-by-case basis. A fine may appear to be a slap on the wrist for an organisation that literally has more money than it can spend, but the menu of minor sporting penalties, from which one or more can be chosen, is more concerning for the teams. A public reprimand is the least painful sanction, though one that a manufacturer-backed team like Mercedes or Ferrari would be embarrassed to receive. More dramatic options include deducting constructors' or drivers' championship points from the relevant season. Then there's suspension from one or more stages of a competition or competitions, excluding for the avoidance of doubt the race itself, which effectively means missing practice sessions. There are two other penalties that affect future performance rather than past performance: a reduction in the team's own cost cap for the following year, and limitations on the ability to conduct aerodynamic or other testing. So what happens if a team exceeds the limit by more than 5% and enters the material sporting penalty zone? One aspect of the sanction is clear in this case: the CCAP shall impose a Constructors' Championship points deduction. Furthermore, it may impose a monetary penalty and/or any other material sporting penalties. With the exception of the public reprimand, all of the penalties outlined for a minor violation remain options. However, two new and harsher penalties are added to the menu: suspension from an entire competition or competitions, including for the avoidance of doubt, the race itself, and most notably, exclusion from the championship. The CCAP selection of a penalty from the range available for minor and major violations remain to be seen, but the rules make it clear that the circumstances will be considered. Essentially, if you cooperate with the CCA and the FIA's auditors and are open and honest, you may be better off. Any element of bad faith, dishonesty, willful concealment or fraud, failure to cooperate, a record of multiple breaches within the year or breaches in a previous year, and the quantum of breach are all aggravating factors. Mitigating factors, on the other hand, are voluntary disclosure, a track record of compliance, full and unfettered cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, unforeseen force majeure events. Now, will teams be able to use global inflation as a case of force majeure, citing the conflict in Ukraine as a key driver? Those who expect to exceed the cap are undoubtedly aware of the significance of the 5% cutoff and the associated lower penalties. However, they don't know how those penalties will be applied, so even aiming to stay within that 5% is a bit of a gamble. Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto commented on the situation, saying, "In the regulations, there is a threshold which is 5%. If you do not exceed the 5% on the top of what's the budget cap threshold, it will be considered a minor breach. And what's a minor breach in case of force majeure? What will the stewards and the FIA decide on that in terms of penalties? No idea. But I don't think there's any way for us and for many teams simply to stay within. And even laying off people, I don't think that's a good and right choice. It's already summertime. By the time you organise it and you do it, the benefit it can have is not sufficient to cope with the excess of prices and costs we've got." And like Horner, Binotto is adamant that without an upward adjustment to balance inflation, multiple teams will violate the regulations. What will be the implications? For me, the most important is many teams will breach it, and that I think will be simply bad for the financial regulations. And we'll start debating if a financial regulation is worthwhile, is it working, and putting everything back in discussion. And I think that, again, to avoid that, because it's important to have a cap somehow, I think the only way is to take a breath, take some more time, and try to do a better and proper job for next year and the following one. In response, Horner raised an intriguing point about how close some might try to get to the 5% mark in typical F1 fashion of pushing the limits. I think certainly all the major teams are going to breach that 140 count this year. As Mattia has pointed out, there's a 5% threshold for a minor breach. What is the penalty for a minor breach? And what we don't want to do is end up playing a game of chicken, as to say, does he go to 4.9% over? Do we go to 4.7% over? And that will be worth one upgrade that could be the differentiating factor of this World Championship. So, the top team executives have been very vocal in the media about the possibility of exceeding the cap, and they've been equally open in F1 Commission meetings and other similar gatherings. In effect, they're not hiding anything and are laying the groundwork for multiple teams to exceed the $141.2 million cap, leaving the CCAP with a difficult task of allocating penalties once the final numbers are crunched post-season. What will come of it? Well, nobody knows, but the paths to take are anything but straightforward. So, what are your thoughts on the entire situation? What should the FIA do? Be lenient or follow their regulations in the face of record inflation? Could a cost-cutting violation ultimately decide the championship? We'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and don't forget to click the bell button to be notified of future videos.